Okay, thank you. Thank you again for these exciting presentations. And please, our speakers, turn on your cameras so we are ready for the Q&A session. I would like to encourage our participants to take up this opportunity to submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom interface. We'll soon open the Q&A session. Before that, I would like to clarify the terminology here. C2G will use solar radiation modification to be in line with the latest report of IPCC. So, but often SRM is referred as solar radiation management and geoengineering, solar geoengineering, and many others. So I think this is worth now highlighting here the terminology. Also, before picking up some questions from our participants, I would like to ask our speakers to share a little bit your thoughts, because this first time you see each other's presentation. I want to see if you have any reflections, thoughts. Please do feel free to share with us. Any volunteer? Matthias, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I can go first. Yeah, sure. I think all three of our presentations show that the ultimate answer, if we pose a question around the SDGs and solar radiation modification, you know, whether it's desirable or not, basically, the ultimate answer to that is today, really, it depends, and we can't answer it, actually. And I think that's the starting point for this conversation. We all bring different questions to the table, different focus, and interpret the body of knowledge in different ways. And I think this shows, you know, that the need for diversity in working on this.
Thank you. Indeed, a lot of unknowns, an unknown of unknowns. Any other thoughts? Holly, Paulo?
Yeah, we have one question here that about the cost benefits estimations, you know. So basically, we do not have any cost estimate yet, because even the technology is not mature enough for deployment. So how much would it cost? So how much would be the governance of the system to pay for such climate intervention? So we are well before that, because we don't know even if it's fully feasible. We don't have the technology to do that, as well as we don't know the implications for the climate system as a whole. So basically, it's too early to do any cost estimates.
Thank you, Paulo, for sharing your thoughts. Anyone want to respond to this question? Yeah?
I mean, I agree completely with what Paulo said. I guess for me, looking at solar radiation modification through the lens of the SDGs and looking at the body of research that exists, it's pretty clear that there are just so many gaps. It's really a preliminary concept. And then the question is, should we be designing a research agenda that aims to fill those gaps? Who might fund it, who might be interested in participating? Seems like very early days. And I guess maybe I was interested in a update from both the other panelists, because you're more informed with the IPCC process than I am. Are there any updates about how this might be looked at in the next report cycles going forward?
Right. Thank you. I have one question here if we don't use SRM, can we ever realistically expect to deliver the SDGs given the lack of progress with attempts to address emission to date?
Very good question. So basically, with climate change or without climate change, it's a major question if you can achieve the SDGs anyway. So further down, going with the solar radiation management and the SDGs is even more uncertain. So basically the SDGs are a guideline for sustainable development, of course, but we are not certain that can be achieved by 2030 or even 2050, because they are very ambitious goals, absolutely necessary to build up a sustainable society, but without climate change or with climate change, it's very hard to achieve. But one thing is for sure, climate change will make the SDGs much more difficult. Difficulties with the water availability, difficulties with food, difficulties in sustain a society with the 10 billion people in 2050. So climate change will make the SDGs much more difficult to achieve.
Thank you, Paulo. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. This is the general sort of trend that one can observe. I think I view the SDGs not as, you know, a one milestone kind of question, but indeed as a global trajectory towards which we want to be moving as fast as we possibly can. You know, leaving no one behind being in a way the motto there. And I wouldn't like to answer this question as a yes or a no, because I think either way, we know the direction of travel that we need to be engaging in or need to be on the path already a long time ago. And every bit helps, right? I mean, the pursuit of the SDGs in and of itself is worthy of our collective efforts. And yes, we know that climate change is rendering achievement of these goals a lot harder. And so there is an interconnection, which we also discuss in our report. But it's very hard to quantify, really. And it's in that sense also that ties into the whole trade-off challenge around these questions is, you know, with more effort in one area, does that help or decelerate efforts in other areas? Those are very difficult to answer, those questions, but we need to be aware of them, those trade-offs, and need to try as best we can leverage the synergies.
Right. Okay. No more feedback. Let's move on to another question about stakeholder engagement. Some of you have mentioned in your presentations, you know, the consideration use or not of SRM will have greatest implications in less developed countries who are currently least engaged in the debates about SRM and the research on it. So what, according to you, what are the factors for this situation? How might this engagement gap be bridged?
I think that the gap is, with regards to solar radiation modification, is broadly the same as the gap in climate change and climate policy engagement more broadly. So any effort that aims to address that would also help with solar radiation modification, possibly. I wouldn't treat this as separated out from these broader patterns of inequality, of access to forums where these issues are being debated and so forth. I think it's all of a piece.
Thank you.
I'd say it's more pronounced in the case of SRM, and that's because there's been some degree of effort to fund research and policy advice in the global south, if we want to put it that simply, over the last 2 decades or so, in line with the United Nations negotiations and in line with the efforts of preparing domestic action all across the planet. And given that SRM is still a nascent topic, this hasn't taken place to anywhere comparable level so far. So I think it's on the advanced industrialized nations, in my view personally, to accelerate this and to facilitate this, because a lot of countries don't have, even in their negotiation teams at the United Nations, the capacity to keep an eye on all the different moving parts. It's a mere matter of personnel at some degree to be able to follow all the different moving discussions in the political sphere. And the same is true in research, I think, where a lot more support needs to happen for this for there to be a ground on which different countries can start deliberating on the political side of things.
Paulo?
Yeah, I agree with Matthias, but there is one very important point. Without the engagement of the global south or developing countries, this will be absolutely terrible in terms of governance and also in terms of impacts, because it's very clear that the countries who will suffer most impact from climate change are actually developing countries from the global south that do not have the technological and the capital investment to really fight climate change. And the same with the solar radiation management. So basically, the engagement of the global south is absolutely essential.
Thank you. Great. And then I would like to ask a further question on that. Then, according to you, are there any appropriate fora or process within which to consider these issues, and where we can engage more actors from the global south?
Yeah, it's very hard to engage researchers because from the global south on this particular issue, because of course there are much more pressing issues for them right now, like increase agricultural productivity, fight problems with water availability, and development, industrial development, and high-tech development for sure. So basically, the problems of the global south that they have to address are well below the level of solar radiation management. But also we know that eventually in 20, 30 or 40 years, we may have to use some kind of the geoengineering techniques. So we may be we may, let's say, be necessary to be used if you heat up the planet by 4 to 5 degrees. So, and then the engagement of the global south will be even more important than solar radiation management itself, research right now. So basically, it's a very complicated matter how the planet will develop these things with the developed countries in one side, the developing countries on the other side. It's a very complex game that is not clear yet how it will evolve. And I think it is the task of association like the Carnegie Geoengineering Initiative to really engage developing countries on this boat as soon as possible in order for them to take to participate more, let's say, in this international effort.
Thank you, Paulo. Holly?
Yeah, I also think we can think of it in terms of developing a pipeline of talent and creating jobs. So in scientific research, so can philanthropists or other agencies in the global north fund positions for young researchers that are getting their careers started in the global south? And can they do it in a way where they're not just learning about, how to research solar radiation modification, but also other climate impacts, and maybe they work on this topic for a few years and they have some capacity in it that can be used later on, but their careers are broader and serving their communities as well. I mean, I think that's the type of program that funders and others could work on right now that could have huge benefits the next decade or two.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I think one way to go about it from an industrialized country point of view would be through collaboration with domestic universities and universities abroad, where this capacity is being fostered through that collaboration. And of course, that's actually, that offers an opportunity for learning that goes both ways, because so far, seeing the very limited range of SRM experts situated essentially in a handful of countries in the global north, there's huge blind spots. That's quite natural. I mean, there's simply not enough geographical diversity in the experience that flows into the design of research and models, let's say, to really capture the global span of these possible implications. So this is, in my view, this is very much also in the interest of possible industrialized countries who might be looking to fund such research collaborations. Another angle that I would think might be a possible catalyst in this would be to see whether regional academies of science can be supported in starting to develop regional assessments for different continents, different parts of continents that specifically have an eye out on the regional implications, to pinpoint open questions in that regard, and to make sure that we're not, as a community of researchers, not going at this with a absolutely myopic approach where we completely overlook key questions.
Matthias, yeah, was a very good point. So the World Academy of Science already started a strong movement to engage the developing countries, but mostly on adaptation to climate change and mitigation of emissions. So basically, right now, these are the two top priorities, especially adaptation. So basically, and how to do adaptation and mitigation together with economic development for the global south. So basically, this is a big challenge. And as you mentioned, this have to be done regionally, because the reality of Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia are very different from each other. And we need science to do that in coordinated science effort that the World Academy of Sciences is starting to do right now.
Okay, thank you. We are close to the end of this session. If any of our participants want to raise a question, burning question, please do that. Otherwise, we'll close it shortly. One more question. I realize this is a very complex and challenging issues. I want to bring a more challenging group of technologies to this discussion. We have another question about CDR and SRM, CDR, carbon dioxide removal. So will we potentially need to use CDR and SRM at the same time to reach global climate targets? If so, how can the governance of both approaches be coordinated to minimize any negative effects on the delivery of the SDGs? Anyone wants to pick up the question?
Sure. I mean, I think that if you're going to use SRM, you definitely want to be using carbon dioxide removal as well as mitigation, because that's the way that you could eventually end the solar radiation modification program. So it's kind of a given that with SRM, you would have some amount of CDR in my view. I mean, normatively, that seems to be the way forward. So in terms of coordination, I do think on the research side, there are some interactions that should be studied biophysically, and there are some research groups that are thinking about that. On the policy side, I think this is one of the central challenges. How do you begin an SRM intervention or program, which would last decades, if not centuries, with this goal that you would be removing carbon and then follow through with the removing carbon? I mean, what accountability mechanisms are there for that? I'm hoping that we're going to be having those discussions, because this is a time horizon that I don't know of any government or policy process that's working well on that multi-decade time horizon problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to complement that, mention that, of course, carbon dioxide removal is absolutely essential. But let's pay attention to the last few papers proposing large-scale carbon dioxide removal, like the one recently in Science a few weeks ago, proposing to plant 1 trillion trees to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So basically, two things. First, photosynthesis is the only effective way to remove CO2 from the atmosphere right now. And it's economically feasible, can be done. We have all the technology to do that. But where these 1 trillion trees will have to be planted? Mostly in tropical areas. Because of course, the time that a tree takes to develop in the boreal forest versus tropical forest is order of 5, is lower in boreal forest. And then these tropical countries will be pressed, for their land area for producing food versus planting trees to remove CO2 from developed countries that have emitted then to the atmosphere as fossil fuel burning. So is this right? Is this correct? How to make the compromise between all the things. So basically CDR also, as well as solar radiation management, have serious troubles in terms of the science behind it and also the implementation.
Yes, that's very true. And I think, we had a discussion on this in a separate webinar, which maybe you'll hear about as well, where these questions are really pertinent at this point in time, especially since there's more and more nations and more corporations even who are announcing that they are going to achieve net zero emissions most by mid-century. And most of these announcements imply a very strong use of some form of CO2 removal. And it's not so much a question of either or, but indeed how and how much we use these different approaches. And we need to accelerate emissions reductions much more. And as I've had in my presentation, removal of CO2 is really just an add-on on that. And SRM, should we ever consider it as desirable as a global community, would be an add-on on that, on all of the above so far. So yeah.
Thank you, Matthias. With that, I think we will close our session shortly. A few messages to our participants. Thank you all for joining us today. And you can find further resources on this topic, SRM, and other topics on CDR on our website, including a study on the issue that Matthias is contributing to. And now we want to close the session. Thank you again. Bye-bye.